Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm back with Amos Zweig and we are discussing some interesting topics with regards to ethics or political philosophy, you could say, because very recently there happened a huge, what you could say, a huge conflict in Washington DC with, I suppose, extreme Trump activists getting into the Capitol Hill in Washington DC and creating a huge chaotic situation there, and there has been a huge drama in the United States, especially with Trump and his administration and how people react to that. So it would seem that what's happening there is a reflection on the sort of the extreme reactionary forces within the Trump movement protesting against the status quo or the Democrats or what they perceive to be their enemy. So one could almost say that those people who either attack the system or are prepared to attack the system, they would say that it is just to do so. It's legitimate because many of them seems to think that the government or the Democrats or the global elites or establishment are destroying and undermining their national identity and national sovereignty. So therefore it's legitimate to do so. So it seems like we have a clash here when it comes to conceptions of justice. So Amos, what would you say to this conflict here on how perhaps we could understand how many of the, for instance, Trump people understand justice or nationalists understand justice as compared to, for instance, cosmopolitans or globalists?
Yes, thank you, Christoffer. I think this what do you call it? When I heard about this in the news that this happened, I really started thinking about this divide between the globalist or the nationalist view of the world. And I think this is a very important, or maybe the most important debate that is happening right now in our society, the political debate about how society should be structured. And I'm sure I will not be able to summarize the whole position, but maybe I can make a start and then we can see what comes out of it. So I think that the people who think more nationalistic or more locally, they defend a position somehow along the lines that if a group of people come together and voluntarily define themselves as a nation or a people or just as a group that wants to live together and structure their lives together, then this is what gives them the legitimacy to do so. That the legitimacy of a government comes from the consent of the governed, and that this is basically a bottom-up process that that every group of people that just define themselves as a group have this right to organize their own lives as they please, and nobody else has the right to impose their will onto them. And so it is a question also of sovereignty, of who is the sovereign, who is the highest power, or who has the last word in deciding on a certain territory or in a certain group of people what the rules should be by which this group lives. I think this is the notion of the people that were ready to take this Capitol Hill by force, basically, because they feel that this notion is under attack by another notion, which I have a bit more of a hard time to define, but I think it has something to do with this notion that every human has equal rights and should have equal rights and equal opportunities because he is a human. And there should be absolutely no difference between an American or a Mexican just because of the place they were born, or what their parents decided or did or whatever, but that all humans should be equal in this sense, equal before the law and have equal opportunities. And if you think along these lines long enough, then you have to come to a sort of view of the world that basically the entire world should be under one coherent set of rules and human rights that are enforced everywhere. And then of course there needs to be a structure that enforces all these human rights everywhere. And then you get into a more globalist or cosmopolitan, as you said, view of the world, that the entire world should be under one organization and jurisdiction. And so then you can effectively work against money laundering or child trafficking or weapon smuggling or all of this stuff. So I think these are roughly, as a start, the two positions that are in a fight here. And I will be very interested in this discussion, what we find out about this.
Right, yeah, good points. So as the media and many others point out, it seems like the recent protests are linked to Trump arguing that the recent election was cheated on by the global media or establishment, that it was stolen from him illegitimately. But as you say, we might discover that there is a deeper ideological conflict going on here with regards to how people understand the nation and community and justice. So as you say, nationalists or nationalist-oriented or national conservatives, they put some emphasis, strong emphasis on the national community or national identity, that there is this community that is the nation, which has a right to exist and sustain itself without interference by others, which might undermine this national sovereignty. Now, I do think that as some people, as you say, would have this sort of liberal notion that it's based on the consent of the governed, this national community, that people voluntarily go together and form the nation. But I do think that other people perhaps reject that notion and see the nation as something natural based on human nature, that we form nations because of our human essence. So there might be some divide within national oriented people there, but yes, it seems like it's about the emphasis on national community, national sovereignty, and then you have you could say, cosmopolitical or globalist view of viewing the world, that we should rather emphasize human being as a member of the world community, the global humanity, perhaps we could say, and therefore a national sovereignty might sometimes be, according to some people, barriers to have a peaceful world community, so that they might weaken certain national borders or barriers. So that seems to be a very strong conflict when it comes to this issue, and many of the Trump activists or extremists, they fear that the governmental establishment, or at least very huge parts of that establishment, is buying this globalist notion and thereby threatening the American way of life. And since the American nation has a right to exist by itself, this is unjust, and therefore it is legitimate to rebel in a way. So it's not just about the establishment stealing the election from Trump, which many of them will also believe, but it's this deeper ideological conflict, because this rebellion wouldn't just pop up out of a ideological vacuum. There is some ideological basis for it, as you say. So I think this needs to be taken into account, and the debate between globalism or nationalism is more crucial than many people perhaps realize, that indeed we see this effect on national culture and values and beliefs being changed due to, for instance, economic globalization, but also governments, not the world governments, but for instance, the UN, the EU, the World Trade Organization, and sort of intergovernmental panels. People would see those as a threat to national sovereignty. And we see also the rise of nationalist movements in Europe reacting against this tendency. So we should understand that this is a very important ideological framework to view the conflict between some people and other people in. That seems to be one of the most what could you say, preeminent ideological conflicts of today, at least in the West.
Yes, I think you are absolutely right with pointing to the ideological basis of this very surprising action that we have seen here. And I think many of the people that took part or supported this taking of the capital, they of course would argue exactly along those lines. They would say, when like it is our duty to protect our sovereignty and our constitution against enemies from within and from without. And if the government becomes corrupt and starts to sell off our liberty for some globalist scheme, then we have the duty to resist and to fight for the freedom that our fathers died for, and so on and so on. So I think there is a strong argument there. What I really found interesting is I think that I have this conflict that we have now started to address. I have this conflict within myself as well, because I can feel some sympathy for both arguments that we have made. So on the one hand, I sympathize that a group of people has the right to decide how they want to live together, and why should anybody else have a right to come and interfere and tell them how they should live? I subscribe to this argument, but on the other hand, I also subscribe to the argument that human rights, like not some exaggerated versions that have come up lately, but the fundamental notion that every human being should have the right to life, liberty, property, freedom from torture, a speedy and open trial, and so on, like these basic human rights. I think this is a great achievement, and I think that I would like to live in a world where this is more the standard by which people are judged or governments are judged. And of course, I also see that nationalism can be a big threat to freedom and to peace. So if you look at the history of the 20th century, then you see a lot of problems that can come out of nationalism as well. So I really think it's interesting that I somehow have this conflict within myself. And I just realized today in this discussion that maybe there is an inconsistency somewhere within me, that I hold two values at the same time, which are not commensurate, and I'm not sure how I should organize them so that it becomes free of contradiction.
Yeah, very good point. I feel that I have sort of two, you could say, ideas or considerations on this issue, which might seem to conflict each other on some level, and they need to be sort of resolved, or there needs to be find a balance between these two, as you say. And I, for instance, would say then that yes, human beings by nature form social communities. They form sort of communal bonds with other human beings, and this might result in a sort of national community, and that I am fully prepared to admit that that's natural, and that might be just to have some sort of national identity or community. That in some cases that might be natural, because we are, after all, social animals, as we have discussed earlier. So to form some sort of national community and a and a national government whose primary responsibility is to take care of its citizens and those national values and cultures within that community. I would sympathize and agree with those notions. However, I wouldn't say that it is completely irrelevant what kind of national values or cultures are present. I think it matters what kind of ideas and values a particular nation hold or esteem. I believe that some values and cultural notions are good and others are bad, and some might be terribly bad and extremely immoral. So it's just to, in some sense, remove them, even though that might, you could say, undermine some sort of national tradition. I'm thinking of some, to take some extreme example, some African communities practicing female gentilation and other very bodily and harmful interventions to children and other very brutal activities. Or some very superstitious communities in Africa which might attack people, even children, because they believe they are witches or monsters or some superstitious belief, and thus they might attack fundamental human rights or human dignity in that particular community. And that's happening some places in Africa and probably other places in the world as well. And one might say, well, such traditions or values, they are inherent in that community and they have been for a very long time. Yes, that might be true, but still those values or practices or traditions might be very immoral, objectively speaking. And therefore, I would see it as just if someone came and removed those particular practices, even if those practices were a part of the national culture, you could say. So that's where I would see that's the two important considerations that I would have. That on the one hand, we see that human beings are social animals. They have a nature and they might form communities, perhaps on a national level, and have a national government, national culture, and that's completely natural and fine. But on the other hand, there might also be some cultural elements or values that are objectively unacceptable and needs to be dealt with somehow, even if they are national. So yeah, what do you think on the relevance of the content of national culture, as I explained?
I think it's actually a very big problem, this question. So, but where to start? So the problem is that who is the person who gets to decide which values or cultures are good and which ones are not? Because and I think the difficult part comes in when you say they are objectively bad, or objectively, this is objectively worse than that. And I understand the emotion behind it, but I think it's very difficult because, of course, the people in this country that burn the witches, they could just as well say, look at these horrible European people. There are witches running around in their country everywhere, and nobody is burning them. That's a big problem. We should now invade this country and show them how the right way to manage society is. So the problem with this notion, and I don't know the solution, but the problem is, of course, that this kind of notion can serve as a justification for basically for endless wars. Because if you say, okay, you have to stop doing this, and then the other people say, hell no, this is how we have lived for 2000 years, this is perfectly fine, we will not stop doing this, and then you have to either say, okay, then we will come and make you stop, or you say, okay, you do whatever you want on your country, even though we find it horrible, but we will not accept this kind of actions here on our territory. So yes, I think this is the big problem. And to the other point with the social animal that naturally builds communities, I agree, as we have discussed earlier. Yes, but what do you think of this problem?
Right, that's a very good problem, or I could say difficult issue, we might say, and I think it goes back to the philosophical dilemma between, for instance, you could say metaphysics and epistemology. That what is the true, objectively true facts and values that people and communities should hold, which is the sort of metaphysical focus, but on the epistemological focus, it's rather how do we know which values and ideas are objectively the best or better or worse than others? How do we determine it, and who has the right or authority to determine that? And that seems to be the dilemma, that we have the metaphysical focus on, okay, here is the right and true values, and here's the wrong one, so we should promote the objectively true at the expense of the objectively bad. But on the other hand, you have the epistemological focus on, yeah, but how do you know that those are the objectively true values and ideas? And since we don't necessarily know this for sure, we should greatly hesitate toward actually acting based on our perception of what is objectively true and binding and moral. However, that approach, this epistemological or skeptical approach, has also huge problems. I would say that you might fall into sort of a cultural relativism on the one hand, that you believe that morality is relative to what each community practices. But the extreme conclusion of that is that, for instance, slavery or female bodily harm that happens in some places in Africa are right relative to them. So you might have this very problematic conclusions that people wouldn't necessarily people would hesitate toward admitting. So, or for instance, if you find the Roman Empire practicing huge amounts of slavery before the Middle Ages, most people would agree that, well, this slavery problem should be dealt with in one way or another. So I don't think people will really be, I don't think many people would be prepared to admit that, no, we should just let these African communities burn or kill those witches, even children, as they perceive as witches, because we would see that as so fundamentally wrong that we cannot really, people would hesitate toward actually saying, no, we just leave them at peace, because what if we are wrong? So I don't think we can take that approach that we'll just have to be skeptical of all values and ideas that we hold, because if we take that to the extreme conclusion, then that might really, then we might let injustice happens, because we are not sure if it's injustice or not, or perhaps we might never say that the government is, our own government is allowed to, for instance, punish certain people for certain crimes at all, because what if we are wrong and those crimes aren't really immoral after all? So I think to take this epistemological approach that, well, we don't really know what's good and bad, so we can't really judge based on that, I think that's a dangerous approach as well. So I don't think people would be prepared to take that sort of mentality toward other cultures and ideas and values, because again, the extreme conclusions based on that might be dangerous. So of course I would say that to the question of how do we know the right values from the wrong, the truth from falsehood, we would need to use some sort of reason, for instance, discover the natural law, as many traditional philosophers would argue that we discover through our reason basic natural moral principles in nature, and we can apply those to specific communities and judge them based on our reason. Some people might argue that we also need revelation from, for instance, some divine authority to make us sure what is the right from wrong. So I do see the dilemma that, of course, not all people would necessarily use reason to find the exact right ideas and values, and perhaps our reason is sometimes influenced by biases and problems. So I do see the practical difficulties but I don't think we can take the idea that we need to be skeptical at all those ideas of what is objectively right and wrong. I do think we need to make some judgments and base our actions on that. We cannot just take the purely skeptical approach, I would say then. So
yes, I really like this, how you first divided between the epistemological and the metaphysical problem, and then also your demonstration how the very epistemologically skeptical approach also has huge problems, because it leads to moral relativism, which in the extreme makes it completely impossible to act in any way at all. Like, you could, even our own society can punish this rapist or even put him in jail or stop him from raping more women, because how can I be sure that this is actually wrong? So this is of course a very stupidly extreme example, but I see that the moral relativism is also a very big problem, and I am by no means a moral relativist. So it seems to me, and this goes to an earlier point that you just made in passing, that it is a question of finding the right balance. And I think here in this, also in this question between moral skepticism and just going and trying to impose our own values on people who live on the other side of the globe, maybe it is a question of finding the right balance. So for me, intuitively, I feel like we have a right, or each group of people or community has a right to be certain of their own perception of what the right values are, and to be so certain that they say, we believe these are the right values and we will enforce them here on this piece of land on which we live. I think this is absolutely essential, that one has the courage to do this, even though you cannot be perfectly certain. On the other hand, I also believe that it is at least very problematic or difficult to say, we are certain that these values are the right values, and so we will go to a completely foreign community that hasn't done us personally any harm and start enforcing our values onto them. Because I'm not sure, I don't think this right can be universalized, because as I have said before, if the other group also believes the same thing, then they will also try to come to our territory and enforce their values onto us. And so it will be always war. So maybe it is better to let other people live by their own customs, even if I think they are reprehensible, because I respect their sovereignty over their own territory and community. And I can maybe justify this with believing that over time, the better values will spread. So I don't have to go and spread the values with the sword, because the better values will over time spread by themselves. Yes, so what do you think of this?
Right, I think you made some interesting points, and I my own beliefs, I should say, relate to them, because, so on the one hand, I would say that yes, I would focus on this sort of the metaphysical approach or metaphysical focus, that there are right values, and I would actually say that right values should be imposed on people because they are right. But I wouldn't then say that therefore we need to forcibly impose all the right values on all parts of the world, of the earth. for instance, I would reject this American notion, for instance, that the US military should be the police force of the world and invade nations if they find their dictator brutal or tyrannical. Even if the dictator actually is brutal and tyrannical, I would greatly hesitate before putting an entire military force into that country and invading it, mostly because such invasions might create huge amounts of damage. And it might be counterproductive. Perhaps there will be mutual war, of course. So I would reject the notion that, oh, then let's invade Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia, as for instance some neoconservatives would idea that we should spread democracy all across the world, as they would hold. Now it's disputable whether democracy is as good of a system as people believe, but that's another discussion, of course. The point is, I would agree then that we shouldn't necessarily go around and forcibly change cultures and communities all around the world in the name of the right values, even if, at least in theory and in principle, right values should be imposed on all. So I would then say that pragmatically or strategically speaking, we should take more of a gradualist approach and try to find peaceful methods to integrate good and right values into foreign communities in a sort of gradual way that might be open and inviting. So the goal should always be to reform or to improve those communities, but it should be in a peaceful and sustainable manner, not necessarily go to war or invade or very brutal measures. So I'm not quite sure whether the right ideas would necessarily be spread around the world, because I also think human beings have this capacity to be convinced of false ideas that might seem very convincing. So I do believe that there might be moral regression, and that's a huge problem as well. But at least I would agree that when we're looking at communities and we find them having horrifying elements, we should remove them, and that should always be the goal. But the method is open for debate, and I think we should, in many cases, use a pragmatic and, to a certain degree, peaceful and gradualistic approach, because to completely overthrow a community might have very, very severe consequences, and we might not even see the consequences yet when we do that. So we have to do that with caution and prudence. What do you say to that?
Yes, I completely agree. I think this is a very well put, because I do agree that the right values should be spread because they are the right values. And I also believe that there are values that are clearly superior to other values or ways of living that are clearly superior to other ways of organizing communities. And so that's on the one hand, but then on the other hand, I really like how you describe this, that this does not mean to go everywhere and force these values onto other people, but it could just as well mean to try to educate people or to lead by example, or to maybe just show them, hey, if you change this here a little bit, then it will be a little bit better. So this gradual and voluntary and peaceful approach, I think, is very important. And also, I'm a big fan of this quote to first take the log out of your own eye before you go and try to take the splinter out of your neighbor's eye. So also our cultures here are not perfect, and there are still big enough problems that we have to solve within our own communities. And just as an example, many people in the West always talk about female genital mutilation and how horrible and evil it is, but nobody in the West ever talks about male genital mutilation, where you cut off the foreskin of little boys without their consent, without medical necessity. And this is done like to 10 to 20%, I think, of people in the US, it's higher. In Europe, it's lower, but still, yeah, this is just one example. There are still enough problems that we can solve just here in our own communities. And so that's the one thing. You shouldn't be too high and mighty about, oh, we are so developed and we are so perfect, and now we are going to teach these savages how you should live. And the second thing is, of course, that such developments take time. So to go from a feudalistic system to democracy took, I don't know, 100 or 200 years in Europe, and a couple of huge wars and huge bloodbath, and the French Revolution where thousands of people's heads were chopped off. So it's not that you can just go into some country and say, hey, maybe you should just, instead of having a king, you should just have a democracy, and this is how you vote, and this is how you make the anonymous ballot. And then these people will say, ah, yes, now we get it, and then it's all done. Of course, it is a very long and gradual and difficult process, just as it was here in our own country, just the 200 years back. So yeah, these are just 2 points that I would add to your statement from before.
Yes, I completely agree with them, that indeed we have many problems within our old culture and Western sphere, many moral problems. I would also add that the widespread use of abortion is also a huge moral problem. Now, that's also another discussion whether abortion is just or not, but I would believe that it is immoral, but that's another discussion. But generally speaking, yes, it's a thing that we need to be aware of. We should fix our own problems before we are so certain to spread our culture abroad or to other communities. And as we said, we should remember and keep in mind that many of the improvements in human affairs, they are gradual, in a sense that you cannot overturn a society overnight. And this goes back to many of the ideas that the philosopher Edmund Burke argued for in his works, especially Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he condemned the French Revolution. And he was sort of the founder of conservatism, many people would say. And he argued that society has this organic nature, that it gradually changes and improves, and it cannot be treated like a mechanical machine, that some parts can just be immediately replaced and shifted out with something else, because there might be damage to doing it so dramatically and brutally. And he would argue that instead we see that communities flourish and grow through long periods of time where people try out different things and go through a process of trial and error, and gradually they develop the right ways of handling their own communities through traditions and customs that gradually develop. And that's how he would see that a natural and good development of society allows for some space for it to grow over time instead of being immediately overthrown or replaced. And that's partly the reason he condemned the French Revolution, for instance. And that's also something we should keep in mind, instead of being too dramatic or brutal in determining what societies should do. So yeah, those things are important to keep in mind, I would say.
Yes. And I think this is a very good opportunity to kind of close the circle back to the globalist versus nationalist debate. So, because there are 2 things that I from this discussion would like to take into this other discussion where we started. So the one thing is, maybe it is not complete national sovereignty versus complete one world government globalism, but there is some kind of balance in between, that we should find the right balance between these 2 extremes. And the other point is that maybe this right balance will be found through, as you said, a gradual process that develops and adapts with trial and error and with different local variations, and that it is maybe just problematic that some people try to speed this process up. So maybe, and you could also, of course, on the other hand, argue that it is problematic that some people try to slow it down so that it basically comes to a standstill. So both of this is not good, because the globalists would, of course, say these stupid nationalists, they want to freeze time and stay in the 20th century forever. And of course, the other people would feel that some agenda is basically pushed onto them that they don't agree with. So that maybe we need a balance between complete national sovereignty and complete global world government, and that this notion that you mentioned about the gradual process that takes time and that goes with trial and error in different places with different speeds, that this is maybe essential for how this balance can be found.
Yes, I would agree that we could sort of see that these considerations that we have made, they hang together in some important sense, as you laid out. So I would agree that there is some, at least in some level, there is a conflict between some national traditions and community values and some sort of cosmopolitical globalist ideas that the establishment espouses. But I don't think that's the whole picture. I think, as you said, that it's more complicated than that. And I would rather say that the American people or the United States, they have many problems that are interrelated. Their problems is also with the economic system in general, how the government is structured. So not just as much with, it's not only about nation versus the global establishment, but rather a series of problems pertaining to economics, the size of government, and the liberty of its people, how their lives are governed. For instance, the coronavirus situation has probably contributed to how many people feel about the situation. So I do think that we need to take those things into account and not just focus on the nation versus the globe, as you say. And also it's very important to remember that communities go through some gradual process. It's an organic development, and that needs to be respected. And of course, I could sympathize with some nationalists or national conservatives that certainly espouse these views and argue that the governmental structure or establishment is intervening into this organic development and interrupting it. So I would agree that occurs, but it is more complicated than that, simply than state sovereign or national sovereignty versus the global state. So yeah, that's what I would say. How would you sort of end our considerations?
Yes, I think, of course, you are right. It is more complicated than just this one aspect, because in a large community or just generally in life, there are many different considerations that you all have to balance also together. So it's not just the balance between national versus global, but it's also the balance between this set of problems and, for example, the economic freedom or the response to some pandemic or 10,000 other topics. So of course, I absolutely agree. For me, I think the interesting question that came up from this last statement of yours, and maybe if you have time, we can talk about this briefly, or if not, then maybe another time. The interesting question that came up for me is, okay, how can we make sure that a community develops organically? Because maybe some people could argue this is exactly what is happening right now. So to stay with this example of nationalism versus globalism, the globalists pull in one direction and the nationalists pull in the other direction. And in the middle, there is kind of a conflict, and this conflict can become sometimes violent, or sometimes more active, or sometimes it's a little bit, everything's a little bit more quiet. So some people would maybe say this is exactly the organic development that we are witnessing. So maybe we should be more precise what we mean by organic development versus how it is a not organic development.
Very good point. Yeah. So I would argue that the developments we are seeing in the West right now, or have seen through the last decades, I would not agree that that's a form of organic development. I would rather see it as a very artificial and mechanical and bureaucratic intrusion and interference into local and natural cultures and communities. Both with the economic globalization, when we see that local customs and traditions and economic structures is not gradually developed, but rather dramatically replaced in many aspects with, for instance, multinational corporations coming in and completely overturning how our specific society is structured, or the government, which, for instance, absorbs many of the tasks of civil society. This is also something we have talked about earlier, that welfare was something that families, churches, local communities, neighborhoods dealt with on their own. But now we are seeing that we have this massive bureaucratic state absorbing many of those tasks that civil society had before. So as we talked about earlier discussions, this is also very important to remember. And I think therefore that we're not witnessing an organic development, but rather an artificial, mechanical, bureaucratic changing of society, which I would agree with many, because a conservative people is harmful in many respects. Now, certainly there might be some elements of organic development within some communities here and there, but overall I would see the globalization, both economically and politically, as more of an interruption into organic development rather than organic development itself. So yeah, I think I'm going to let you comment on this, and then I'll sort of sum up the discussion.
Perfect. Because I think I realized something as I was listening to your answer. And I think we could say, and I'm interested on your final notes then on this, that an organic development comes from the bottom up. It emerges basically spontaneously within a community, because most of the members of this community want this change and move towards it voluntarily on their own. And opposed to this is a kind of top-down enforced change that the majority of the population locally actually resists. And then this change has to be forced onto them by some people who consider themselves the elite, either because they are very rich, or because they have a lot of weapons, or because they have a lot of university degrees, and they feel like we are somehow better and smarter, and we should force these other people to their own good, and then enforce this change onto them from the top down, whether they want it or not. I think this we could characterize as an not organic development of a community, whereas the bottom up spontaneous development is the organic one. So for me, I think this was, yeah, very interesting point to realize.
Yes, I completely agree. And I'm extremely skeptical and critical of many of the, you could say, technocratic oriented people who, for instance, dominate aspects of academia, who seem to think that they can rationally plan and calculate how society should be organized in this rational manner. If power is left to us, the enlightened scientists, we would know how society should be developed in the right way. I would completely oppose to that, and that's a very dangerous mentality that we absolutely need to be aware of and try to handle and ultimately remove that mentality, because it's very problematic, and we have seen the effects of that to a large degree. So yes, I would completely agree. And let's then just sum up what we have discussed so far, because as we've seen, we could say that today many people are concerned with the battle between national identity and culture and sovereignty versus globalist ideas of having a cosmopolitical world community. That's how many people perceive the important affairs of the day. That's very central, for instance, to the Trump movement, has this conflict as very important to them. But in reality, we see that it's more complicated than that. So while human beings by nature form communities, we are social animals, we form to some degree nationhood or national cultures, and that's natural and just, we still have to keep in mind that there are differences between cultures and communities when it comes to having the better or worse values and moral systems, and we need to take that into account. And when we see communities having horrible practices and traditions, we should work to remove those practices, but we should be prudent and pragmatic when we actually implement changes. We need to respect the organic nature of society and the fact that it is a very integrated system which develops over time. It's not some mechanical machine we can just use and control however we like some people in academia think, but we need to respect the organic nature of society. So while we should always improve societies morally and in other ways, we should keep in mind that that human nature dictates that we are social beings and that societies are in some sense organic. And lastly, as we discussed, even though many people believe the important conflict is between nation and the globe or globalists, it's important to realize that the problem is more complicated than that. We see rather a problem of huge governmental structures as such, the problem with economic instability, with the coronavirus. So there are other things that people should be aware of. People shouldn't only care about the nation versus the globalists. It's not that simple. So that's how I would sum up the conversation we've been through. Is there anything you want to add lastly to our conversation?
Yes, I just one thing. I think an important point that we also touched on a couple of times is the importance of finding the right balance. So in the very complex problems in life or in how a society should be formed, it is never just this black or this white solution that is the good solution, but there needs to be, we need to find the right balance between many different aspects of one problem, and also, as you just said, between many different problems. So this aspect of finding the right balance is crucial. And also I want to stress this point that we just finished on, that maybe to find the right balance is a process that has to be done gradually and through trial and error, and maybe in different places it happens in different times or at different speeds. And so I really think we should focus on the balance, and we should focus on the organic development that every community has within itself, and not try to impose from the top down some artificial solution to these problems, even if we perceive them as problems, but instead to maybe inform or talk with people, but somehow work on this organic process. The change has to come from the majority of people within this culture, and then it happens from the bottom up. I think these are the 2 points that I wanted to emphasize. And yeah.
Great, and I agree with many of the things you said right there. And of course, this is a complicated matter, so we are open to new ideas and perspective on this. So if anyone in the audience who watches us, if any of you have some new perspectives or arguments or ideas about this, please say so in the comment section below. And perhaps we'll return to some of these ideas and issues on a later occasion as well. So thank you very much, Amos, for joining me in this conversation. And we will return to a new conversation next time. So.
Yes, thank you very much too. It was very interesting and enjoyable.
Yes. So yes, goodbye, and goodbye to everyone in the audience.
Yes. See you all some other time.